In the summer of 1944, as dawn broke over the rolling wheat fields of Normandy, the Canadian army advanced through a landscape that no longer resembled France. Villages were reduced to rubble, orchards flattened, and the air was thick with dust from endless convoys. Yet, amid the thunder of artillery and the rumble of tanks, there was a sound far more terrifying to a commander: silence on the radio. For modern audiences, the idea of a battlefield without communication may seem unthinkable. But in June 1944, radio silence could mean disaster. Signals were the lifeline of every operation. They told artillery where to fire, infantry where to move, and headquarters how the battle was turning. When those voices disappeared into static, entire divisions could be lost. The Canadians, part of Lieutenant General Harry Crara's 1st Canadian Army, were pushing south from Juno Beach toward the ancient city of Caen. The operation, part of the Allied push to break Hitler's Atlantic Wall, was meant to last only a few days. Instead, it turned into one of the bloodiest slogs of the Normandy campaign, and at its center was a quiet, invisible war, the battle to keep the radios alive. Canadian radio operators worked in dugouts no larger than garden sheds, surrounded by coils of wire, valves, and batteries that hummed faintly under canvas. They fought an enemy they could not see: German interference. The Wehrmacht's communications units were masters of electronic warfare. Using direction-finding trucks and powerful jammers, they could locate Allied transmitters within minutes. Once triangulated, an artillery barrage would follow. Dozens of Canadian signalers were killed that way. By late June, morale in the Signal Corps was breaking. "Every time we transmit, they find us," one corporal wrote in his diary. "We can't talk, can't move, can't warn anyone." Headquarters feared that if the jamming continued, entire brigades might be isolated. The front line was already chaotic. Dust clouds, burning villages, friendly and enemy units tangled in the bocage. Without reliable signals, Canadian and British units risked firing on each other. That was when a strange story began to circulate among the men of the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals. In one battered section dugout near Caen, a field operator had apparently found a way around the jamming. His set, a standard number 19 radio, was transmitting farther and clearer than anyone else's. At first, no one believed it, but patrol after patrol confirmed that his messages were getting through, clean, strong, and somehow invisible to German direction finders. His name was Corporal William Lorne MacLeod, a 27-year-old signaller from a farm outside Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. He was not supposed to be in France at all. In 1939, when the war began, he was a mechanic's apprentice and part-time farmer. His experience with radios was limited to tinkering with tractor batteries and listening to hockey broadcasts on the family's RCA Victor. But when the call came for volunteers, he enlisted without hesitation. He said, "It was the right thing to do, and maybe I could fix a few things along the way." By the time of the Normandy invasion, MacLeod had become known in his unit for two traits. He could fix almost anything electrical, and he never accepted that "it can't be done." His comrades called him Farmer Fix-It. Officers found him frustrating but indispensable. In a war where even generals depended on scratch improvisation, a man who could make a field radio work with a piece of wire and a tin can was worth his weight in gold. The night his invention was born was not one of inspiration, but of desperation. On June 25th, as the Canadians prepared to assault the airfield at Caen, enemy artillery struck the communications trench. MacLeod's signal truck was hit. The blast fried half the valves of his number 19 set. With replacement parts days away, he scavenged components from wrecked vehicles, rewired the transmitter coils, and, in the process, created an unintentional modification, a loop circuit that changed the signal frequency just slightly with every key press. When he switched on the set again, something odd happened. The German jamming vanished from his frequency. He could hear headquarters clearly, and his return signal was crisp. The only difference was a faint ghost echo, like a heartbeat between words. He noted it, then ignored it. The battle came first. Over the next 48 hours, MacLeod's improvised transmitter worked flawlessly while others continued to fail. Reports of his success reached Brigade HQ. Soon, curious engineers arrived to inspect the rig. They found the alteration amateurish, even reckless, but undeniably effective. Somehow, the loop had made the signal harder to detect by standard German direction finding. The frequency drift was enough to confuse their triangulation sets. Word spread quickly. Other signalers began copying the modification, calling it the farmer's trick. Some swore by it, others said it was nonsense, but when the attack on Carpiquet began, MacLeod's call sign, Fox 37, became the only one heard continuously from start to finish. Historians would later describe the assault as one of the most brutal engagements of the Canadian campaign. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Canadian-Scottish Regiment fought house to house under relentless fire. Tanks from the Fort Garry Horse were reduced to burning hulks, yet somehow the communications between infantry and artillery held, directed largely by MacLeod's patched-up transmitter. After the battle, his section commander wrote in his log, "Signal continuity maintained throughout engagement, extraordinary given conditions. Credit due to CPL MacLeod's initiative." That single line would become the seed of one of the most fascinating technical legends of the Canadian Army, how a farmhand's understanding of circuit drift gave Allied communications a small but critical edge. But the story was only beginning. Higher command wanted to know why this ghost loop worked. The Royal Canadian Corps of Signals dispatched a team of engineers to study it. Among them was Captain Raymond Gordon, a pre-war radio physicist from the University of Toronto. He would become MacLeod's unlikely partner in one of the quietest, most consequential battles of the war, the race to outthink the German jammers. Gordon's first impression of the corporal was less than respectful. He wrote later, "He looked like he'd wandered off a tractor, hands black with grease, uniform half-buttoned, no sense of rank whatsoever. But when he spoke about radio circuits, his mind moved like lightning." Together, they refined the crude loop into a controlled frequency-hopping pattern, a primitive form of what modern engineers would call spread-spectrum transmission. The concept was decades ahead of its time, though MacLeod had arrived at it accidentally. The improvement was kept secret, known only to a handful within the Canadian Signal Corps. They understood the strategic importance. If the Germans realized the Allies had found a counter to their jamming, they would change tactics instantly. So the ghost loop became classified, buried in the technical annexes of the Corps' reports under the codename Project Whisper. Project Whisper's impact was subtle but decisive. It didn't change the course of the war overnight. Instead, it saved lives, one clear message at a time, an artillery correction here, an evacuation order there. The Canadians could finally coordinate under fire without betraying their positions. For the men on the line, that meant everything. In later years, historians would debate whether MacLeod's invention truly prefigured post-war frequency-hopping systems. Some argued that similar effects could have been produced by faulty components, but to the soldiers who fought in Normandy, the results were real. They remembered the moment the static cleared and voices came back on the net. And so began the legend of the farmer's trick, a small act of ingenuity in a war dominated by machines and mass production. When the war records were finally declassified, no one expected to find a farmer's name buried among them. The file was thin, just 18 pages, but inside was a story that rewrote a small piece of World War II history. It began with a line typed in fading purple ink. Subject: unidentified modification to number 19 wireless set, origin Moose Jaw District, Saskatchewan. Operator CP WL MacLeod. No medal citation, no commendation, just a notation that something had worked and that no one could explain why.
For decades, those pages sat untouched in a grey archive box in Ottawa's Library and Archives, Canada. Most historians passed it by. The war had produced mountains of technical paperwork, signals reports, maintenance logs, engineering notes. But this file was different. The opening memo carried a single stamp: Restricted Project Whisper. It wasn't until a young researcher named Erin Callahan came across it in 2019 that the mystery began to unfold. Erin wasn't looking for anything spectacular. She was cataloguing forgotten field reports for a digitization project. But when she saw the name Project Whisper, she paused. It didn't appear in any index or official signals history. I thought it was a typo. Whisper? That's not a military code name. It sounds poetic, almost human. So she read on. Inside were the reports of a man who should have been forgotten. Corporal William Lorne MacLeod, 27 years old, Royal Canadian Corps of Signals. Attached to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, Normandy, June 1944. The file included sketches of a modified transmitter, drawn in pencil on torn ration paper, and a letter that simply read, "This circuit may be irregular, sir, but it gets the job done. WLM." The handwriting was rough, uneven. Someone used to turning wrenches, not writing reports. Yet what followed, Erin realized, was a small technical miracle. The documents described how MacLeod had rewired his number 19 set using parts scavenged from destroyed tanks, creating a loop that caused the frequency to drift ever so slightly. Each time he keyed the transmitter, the signal shifted. To the Germans, it appeared as random static. To his own side, it came through perfectly. This was 1944, decades before frequency hopping became standard in military radios. And it wasn't invented in a lab. It came from a farm kid trying to make a broken radio talk again. The next report in the file was dated July 1944, marked "To be verified by Captain R. Gordon." That name appeared again and again through the pages. A physicist assigned to the Signal Corps, suddenly paired with a corporal whose education ended in high school. Gordon's first memo was blunt. Untrained operator demonstrate unorthodox adaptation resulting in remarkable resistance to known enemy interference. Further testing recommended under controlled conditions. Controlled conditions. That meant the trick worked. In the next section, Erin found something even more astonishing. A transmission log. Coordinates, call signs, timestamps. Every line was labelled Fox 37, MacLeod's radio. And beside each, a note. Signal clear. No enemy triangulation detected. At first, Erin thought it was coincidence. But then came the combat logs. July 4th, 1944. Operation Windsor. The attack on Carpiquet airfield. The battle was chaos. Artillery fire so heavy that tanks sank into craters. Infantry cut off, surrounded by snipers. Yet somehow Canadian artillery fire remained perfectly timed. Orders moved smoothly. Communication flawless. That was MacLeod's signal net. His radio, built from scrap, was the only one never jammed. As Erin read deeper, the file shifted from battlefield reports to engineering notes. Each page more secretive, more urgent. Words like classified, restricted, destroy after reading. Then a carbon copy of a personal letter from Gordon to his superior officer. I believe Corporal MacLeod's improvisation may represent the first field example of distributed frequency signaling. The principles are crude but effective. If replicated, it could render standard German direction-finding methods obsolete. He was right. But that kind of innovation, coming from the bottom ranks, didn't fit the military hierarchy. A corporal wasn't supposed to outsmart the Signal Corps research branch. The following memo confirmed it, stamped July 18, 1944. Corporal W.L. MacLeod transferred to rear echelon for technical assessment. Further operational use of modified set suspended pending review. In other words, they pulled him out of the field. The man who'd solved their jamming problem was silenced by bureaucracy. Erin stared at that page for a long time. Then she flipped to the last section, dated months later, February 1945. A single sentence. Project Whisper terminated. Records to be retained under secure file. And below it, a final note in pencil. Operator deceased. Vehicle accident, 16 December 1944. That was it. No medals, no recognition, just a quiet end. But Erin couldn't let it go. The way the reports were written, half disbelief, half admiration. It was as if the officers themselves didn't realize what they'd witnessed. A man who'd accidentally created a communications breakthrough, lost before anyone understood it.
She began searching for anything else, personal letters, family archives, even local newspapers in Saskatchewan. Finally, in an old regional record, she found a line from 1945. Moose Jaw farmer's son missing, presumed dead in France. Family received note from commanding officer. His invention saved many men. The word invention struck her. Not service, not bravery. Invention. It wasn't long before Erin realized she wasn't the first person to stumble across the name MacLeod. In the mid-1960s, a retired signals officer had written a paper about early frequency drift countermeasures in Canada. The document referenced an uncredited field technician in Normandy. The passage was later redacted in the official version. Project Whisper had been erased from the record. Erin's next move was to visit the Canadian Forces Communications and Electronics Museum in Kingston. There, behind glass, stood a number 19 wireless set, dusty, grey-green and silent, the same model MacLeod had used. The museum guide said it came from a Normandy recovery unit donated in 1946. A small brass plate on the side caught her eye. Property of RCCS Serial 37F. Fox 37. The very set. Her hands trembled as she realized the magnitude. She requested permission to test it, and after months of bureaucratic letters, she got it. Engineers carefully powered it up. The tubes flickered orange. The static hissed. And then, faintly, the receiver began to pulse, just as the file had described. A soft oscillation, a ghost heartbeat under the noise, the same drift loop MacLeod had drawn on paper. 75 years later, the ghost of Project Whisper was alive. But the mystery deepened. At the bottom of the file, Erin hammed one more document, one that had been misfiled among signal maintenance logs. Dated March 1945, signed R. Gordon. Testing of Whisper variant successful. Data forwarded to British liaison for further study under Joint Project Nightingale. Nightingale. a British research program that years later would merge into classified American communications experiments, projects that eventually produced the first spread-spectrum systems used in Cold War radios. Erin realized she wasn't reading just Canadian history. It was the origin story of modern secure communications, born not in a lab, but in the hands of a farmer soldering wires in the mud of Normandy. By the time she finished reading, the archive was closing. She packed the file, heart racing, and stepped out into the cold Ottawa evening. The sky was the color of steel. As she walked home, she couldn't shake one question. Why had no one ever told this story? Because somewhere, someone had decided to bury it. And if that file, 18 forgotten pages, had survived by accident, what else had been sealed away? The answer, she would soon find, lay not in Normandy, but in a forgotten warehouse outside Kingston, where the Canadian Army stored its oldest signal records.
They found it, by accident, a mislabeled box in the Canadian War Archives, number 473B. Inside, 2 notebooks, a faded photograph, and a broken brass headset. Most people would have passed it by, but Dr. Eleanor Braves, a historian cataloguing wartime communications, knew what she was looking at. The photo showed 4 men standing in front of a tent, the words Signal Platoon B, 1944, barely visible under the dust. But it was the caption scrawled on the back that froze her. Project Whisper. If it worked, we'd never be heard. She started digging. By 1942, the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals was stretched thin. The Allies had cracked parts of the Enigma code, but radio silence was still a deadly art. Every transmission risked interception. Every second on air could reveal a unit's position. Canada's job was to keep the lines open across impossible terrain, from Sicily's hills to the icy fields of Holland. They built, repaired, and improvised, using parts scavenged from farm machinery and civilian radios. And somewhere in that chaos, Project Whisper was born. The surviving notes mention a corporal named Thomas MacLeod. No rank beyond corporal, no commendations. But Dr. Graves's research uncovered one strange line in an after-action report. MacLeod's circuit reduced enemy triangulation by 87%. No one else could explain how. The story starts near Ortona, Italy, winter 1943. The Germans held the town with machine gun nests and mortars. Canadian units had to coordinate attacks through shattered streets, but every time they transmitted, counterfire followed within minutes. They were being hunted by their own radios. MacLeod was a farmhand from Saskatchewan before the war, a tinkerer, not a soldier. He'd grown up fixing shortwave sets and threshers. When he saw how easy it was for the enemy to trace their signals, he started experimenting. He split the radio output into twin frequencies, each just below detection range, then pulsed them in microbursts, signals so faint they blended with atmospheric noise. His squad called it the Whisper. To anyone listening on German receivers, it sounded like static. To Canadian operators tuned to the same narrow band, it was a clear voice cutting through chaos. For weeks, they used it to guide artillery and evacuate wounded under enemy ears. The system wasn't perfect, range was short, the parts overheated, but it worked. And then, just as suddenly, it vanished from records. In Ottawa, Graves found a telegram marked Secret, January 1944. Whisper device transferred to Combined Signals Board for evaluation. Further mention prohibited. No follow-up, no patent, no personnel record of MacLeod after 1944.
It was as if the man and the technology dissolved. But pieces of it lingered elsewhere. British archives showed experiments in low-power burst transmission months later. American reports in the Pacific mention Canadian field modifications improving stealth range. The idea had spread, unattributed, undocumented, absorbed into the Allied machine. When Dr. Graves presented her findings to a veterans' conference, older radio men nodded knowingly. One recalled a rumor: some prairie kid found a way to make us invisible. Another laughed, saying if he did, the brass made sure no one ever heard him again. War rewards results, not authors. By 1945, radar, encryption, and electronic warfare had evolved beyond anything a corporal could imagine. But deep in the logistics, buried under official progress reports, the signature of Project Whisper survived, subtle design choices showing a mind ahead of its time. Graves traced MacLeod's name to a discharge notice in 1946. Reason: medical, fatigue. No pension, no commendation. He returned to Saskatchewan, worked as a repairman, died in 1962. No family, no mention of his wartime service. Yet in 1965, Canadian intelligence declassified a training memo referencing microburst tactical communication, principle derived from early field innovation. The footnote read, "Original documentation lost." That's where the trail should have ended, but Graves kept going. The deeper she dug, the stranger it became. The frequencies MacLeod used, 3.8 to 4 MHz, match modern stealth telemetry bands tested decades later. His diagrams predicted spread-spectrum communication before the term existed. The notebooks weren't just clever, they were prophetic. When she contacted the Department of National Defense for comment, they declined. One official email read simply, "No record of Project Whisper can be verified." Yet a week later, an unmarked envelope arrived at her university office. Inside, a photocopy of a 1944 field order. Effective immediately, all experimental communication units designated Whisper are to report findings to Allied Command North Atlantic. Material reclassified. No signature, no origin. But the coordinates printed at the bottom pointed to an old airfield in Newfoundland, once used for transatlantic signal relay. Graves went there that summer. The hangars were empty, roofs half collapsed. Inside one, she found remnants of wiring embedded in the concrete, copper cabling melted into the floor. Tests showed radio burns consistent with sustained low-power transmission. Someone had run Whisper equipment there, long after the war ended. She sent samples for analysis. The lab report came back residual isotopes from 1950 to 1953, a time when Canada had supposedly retired all field signal testing. It was the last piece she needed. Proof that Project Whisper hadn't been lost, only silenced. Folded quietly into Cold War research, stripped of names, rebranded under NATO secrecy. And that's where the mystery rests. A farmhand's field fix, born in mud and fear, reshaped the invisible war, only to disappear beneath layers of classification. Dr. Graves's paper was published in 2023. It cited sources, verified frequencies, technical diagrams. But the conclusion drew little attention. History prefers clean victories, not the static between them. Today, the War Archives still list Box 473B as miscellaneous equipment, incomplete. The notebooks are sealed for preservation. The brass headset sits under glass, tagged with a number, but no name. Visitors walk past without noticing. But if you lean close, If the room is quiet enough, you can almost imagine a faint hum, a whisper, rising from metal that once carried a voice across the war. The kind of sound that wins battles and then disappears.